Donald Trump's heavily trailed phone call with Vladimir Putin hasn't led to Moscow signing up to a 30-day ceasefire in Russia's ongoing war with its neighbor.
Less than 100 days into President Donald Trump's second term, the war in Ukraine was about to end. After weeks of negotiation and megaphone diplomacy, Trump believed he had Vladimir Putin exactly where he wanted him.
Great things about me, I'm going to say great things about him.
But did Putin just flip the script and betray Donald Trump?
Nitpicking of who said what, the one thing we know is he didn't say that. He rejected the proposal for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire.
This total rejection by the Russian president is not only a slap in the face to the United States, but could possibly lead to Trump stepping away as a dealmaker-in-chief, leaving Ukraine to fend for itself and possibly crushing the Russian economy in retaliation. What will happen to Ukraine? How will Trump respond to Putin? And what exactly will happen next? Let's go back for a little context. Since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, President Donald Trump has been vocal about being the one to stop it. The U.S. president has been adamant about bringing this all to a total stop within the first few days of his presidency. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, and it would take almost a month from his inauguration on January 20th to enter a conversation with Putin. After a 90-minute call on February 13th, the United States and Russia both agreed to a meeting in Saudi Arabia. The meeting was led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. Following the meeting, both Russia and the United States exclaimed that it went very well, and it broke the barriers of communication between the Kremlin and Washington. This comes after President Joe Biden chose to rather ignore Russia instead of talking. The first encounter went so well, the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, extended an invitation to President Donald Trump for the two to meet in Moscow. Unfortunately, there was one seat missing from this table, and that is Ukraine itself. Moreover, the meeting also snubbed any other European stakeholders or backers of Ukraine. The lack of bringing Ukraine on board was seen as frustrating for President Zelensky. But according to Secretary Rubio, the talks were positive, and an agreement had been drawn up to have a high-level team support these ceasefire talks. Rubio continued by saying that the agreement would also discuss what would happen with Ukraine following these peace talks, and that any ceasefire would need to be acceptable to all parties, including the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. This was not a sentiment echoed by President Trump, who went on record blaming Ukraine as the aggressor and then labeling President Zelensky a dictator who was unwilling to hold elections in his own country due to dwindling polls. Just a week after these statements were made at Trump's Mar-a-Lago golf resort, Zelensky was invited to a sit-down with the president at the White House. The meeting didn't go as planned, with Trump going as far as chasing Zelensky out of the White House, telling him that he doesn't have any cards. As punishment for Zelensky's disrespect, President Trump immediately paused all aid to Ukraine, which was followed by preventing allies like NATO and the Five Eyes to provide Ukraine with additional intelligence. To add even more fuel to the fire, Trump went on record on March 7th to state that President Trump was being more generous than he had to be, while calling Zelensky the one who is harder to deal with. At this point, it was clear that Donald Trump had chosen a side. He was actively trying to not only woo Russia, but even talked about lifting sanctions and perhaps bringing them back into the G7, formerly G8. It all seemed like a big bromance between the two strongmen, and the two were rather vocal about striking a deal that would be in the best interest of every country. But before Trump's words had a moment to become cold, President Putin took a page from his book as a former KGB agent and completely stabbed his American counterpart in the back. Russian media publication Pravda released a report suggesting that there will be no generosity nor any concessions from Russia for a ceasefire or peace agreement. Moreover, the publication continued suggesting that the Kremlin would reject any form of NATO or Western troops being put on the ground in Ukraine, and this would be another call to arms for the Russian Federation. Speaking at Russia's Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation, President Putin again reiterated that they are not willing to give up any land, which Russia currently deems part of the Russian territory. This means that Russia is not willing to back down in any way when it comes to respecting the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov would echo Putin's statement, saying that there is no room for compromise, and that if troops were to be sent to Ukraine, it is nothing more than a direct official, undisguised NATO participation in the war. Yet, despite Trump calling Zelensky the harder to deal with when it comes to peace negotiations, Russia is certainly not willing to move or budge in any specific way when it comes to this war. Essentially, Russia is unwilling to make any compromises, aside from the full destruction of Ukraine and ensuring NATO never gains a foothold in the country. But as Trump was cozying up to Putin, withdrawing aid, and stopping any form of intelligence to Ukraine, Russia was taking advantage. Less than a day following the comments, President Putin launched a fresh wave of attacks. It all started with intensified strikes on Donetsk and Kharkiv, leading to at least 20 Ukrainian lives being taken. Another strike in the frontline town of Dobropilya left another 11 Ukrainians in fatal condition. And the worst of it was when Ukrainian rescue workers attempted to help these civilians. They were met with another devastating strike. This meant that almost 50 Ukrainians had lost their lives just moments after Donald Trump was utterly deceived by Russian President Vladimir Putin. These actions just ratified the statements by Zelensky of these actions not being the actions of someone who wants to agree to a ceasefire. By all accounts, it is safe to say that President Trump had been fooled and put his trust in the wrong person to bring this war to an end. In retaliation to this, Trump again went to Truth Social, where he stated that he is considering slapping even more banking and economic sanctions on Russia. And this time, the blow would utterly devastate the Russian economy and its people. Unfortunately, this might now be a little too late, with most people already believing that Putin had deceived Trump and managed to pull the wool over his eyes. This basically means that Russia can disregard Donald Trump and now launch even more vicious attacks, which we will look at a bit later during the course of this video. Without any US assistance, Ukraine can only hold on for a few months, with about 6 months being projected. Perhaps this was Putin's plan all along, simply convince Trump to withdraw support from Ukraine, and then follow this up by launching devastating strikes. It might have been the biggest magic trick a president had ever pulled over a counterpart. So, what's next? As of this video, it is extremely hard to discern what course this war is heading toward. Much like Trump had forced the hand of Ukraine by stopping aid, there could be a way for the United States to perhaps put the same kind of pressure on Russia. If we look at what happened during the Biden administration, Russia was given a 60-day waiver for all energy transactions to take place. With the lapse of this, Russia can no longer use and United States-based banking infrastructure. This means that it is increasingly harder for allies of Russia to do business. However, Donald Trump still has a few cards up his sleeve that could potentially ruin the Russian economy once and for all. First of all, the Trump administration is likely to begin with sanctions, and these could potentially cut off Russia's ability to trade with any Western partners. Russia will likely seek to deepen its relations with both India and China as its major export partners. Should this happen, Trump can naturally stop the pause on military and intelligence-driven aid to Ukraine. In fact, he might even add more aid to the mix, sending a vast array of US military equipment to upend the Russian forces on the battlefield. A move like this might further antagonize Russia, but Trump can justify this by talking about the untrustworthiness of President Putin. Finally, the United States can officially try to induct Ukraine into NATO, which will be a massive slap in the face of Putin and the Russian Federation. All of these will combine to not only devastate Russia on the battlefield, but it will certainly have an impact on the everyday Russians. According to Putin, he needs to finish the job of total destruction in Ukraine, fearing a possible retaliation, and believing that Ukraine will eventually rearm itself. Thanks to Russian news sources, we can get a glimpse inside the mind of the Russian president to understand some of his fears. According to these outlets, Putin fears that, should the war end and Russia give up all its territory, it will be for nothing. Hundreds of thousands of fatalities for the Russians over the last 3 years, and they don't have anything to actually show for this. Moreover, Russia has proven in the last decade that it cannot abide by a ceasefire. Russia has invaded Ukraine no fewer than 25 times to break the initial Minsk agreement that was in place. Should the war end now, and Ukraine is not forced to demilitarize, Russia will be unable to launch such an attack again. This means that Ukraine can shore up its own borders and slowly move more toward a Western regime. It will almost certainly destroy one of the last strongholds Russia had when it came to its former Soviet Union. Fortunately, Zelensky has Europe, and Russia clearly doesn't fear Europe in any specific way. However, Ukraine, although it likes Europe and its support, is not totally convinced that it can provide enough to ensure a ceasefire or even a truce holds up. Furthermore, Russia is frustrated by exactly how close Zelensky has become with Europe, fearing that somehow they might want to add Ukraine to NATO in a way that Russia cannot stop. The induced sanctions in Russia will also need to come to an end. Putin believes that Russia should once again be part of the greater global economy. But despite everything Putin wants, and Donald Trump mentioning that Zelensky does not have any real cards, Ukraine holds some leverage, and this is actually quite powerful. Since August 2024, Ukraine has controlled a large part of Russian territory. They currently hold about 1,000 square miles of territory in the Kursk Oblast, which means that Ukraine will bring some leverage to the negotiation table. Ukraine might want to trade this territory for some territory that Russia currently holds, which is really frustrating the Kremlin. In fact, Putin wants to ensure that Ukraine does not hold any leverage when it comes to negotiations. This means that an ideal world for Putin would ensure that Ukraine loses all the territory it has currently lost, and the war simply stops. If this happens, Putin can turn to his own constituency and say that has won the war, and the lives of thousands of soldiers were not simply wasted. This will not only solidify Putin's position as the leader of Russia, but naturally ensure that the country does not attempt to defy him. But this plan could also backfire in Ukraine. Currently, Ukraine has a lot of top-tier troops and U.S. military equipment stationed in Kursk. With the pause of U.S. aid to the country, Ukraine will quickly see its resources diminish, and this will naturally lead to more experienced troops being caught up in a drawn-out offensive. The problem with this is that it will weaken the Ukrainian defensive line quite severely. But there is one massive bargaining chip that Ukraine holds with Europe. The European Union has frozen about $300 million in Russian assets. This can be brought to the negotiation table, with Ukraine, meanwhile, profiting off the proceeds of these frozen assets. This will undoubtedly frustrate President Trump, especially since he has his eyes on Ukrainian minerals. According to recent data, Ukraine holds about 22 of the 34 minerals that the EU classifies as being critical. However, many of these resources are located in the regions that Russia currently occupies. President Donald Trump has been eyeing these minerals as the cornerstone of his ceasefire proposal. But if Russia doesn't play ball, it might all be for nothing. One of the key deposits that Trump wants is graphite, and it is estimated that Ukraine holds about $86 billion in graphite deposits, of which only 15% had been processed since the start of the war. A study done by the BBC has indicated that one of the biggest mineral deposits is in the area of Donetsk, and should Russia be handed this territory, it will arguably destroy the Ukrainian economy, or at least what is ultimately left of it. All of this was actually noted in the statement when Putin declared 2025 as the year of the defender of the fatherland. The Russian leader emphasized that he would use this as a year to adhere to all the promises he had made to the Russian people following the war. With the Ukraine war becoming more and more intense, and Russian nuclear warfare becoming an even bigger threat, Europe aims to rearm itself in a large and possibly nuclear way. With Poland the next in line if Ukraine falls, Trump's U.S. nukes might be the only deterrent preventing Russia from invading Europe. But he is not the only actor in this regard. Just recently, French President Emmanuel Macron has hinted at sending French nuclear warheads to Poland. This is welcomed by Prime Minister Donald Tusk and could secure the future of NATO. But will the US take this unprecedented move? What does Russia have to say about it? And can anything be done to prevent an all-out war? Today, we unravel some of these questions. Despite Poland not having any nuclear weapons or capabilities at the moment, this was not always the case. In fact, Poland used to form part of the Eastern Bloc nations. While operating under the influence of the Soviets, Poland had various nuclear weapons stationed within its territories. This was mainly Russian nuclear arms, but posed a threat to the West. However, Poland denounced communism in the early 1990s, which meant that it no longer accepted being ruled by the Soviet Union. It was after changing to a democracy that these nukes mysteriously disappeared back into the hands of the Soviet Union. Since the 1990s, Poland has not been known to hold any form of nuclear weapons and greatly relies on its stockpiles of conventional weapons, many of which have come from the United States. However, the situation in Ukraine might become more and more dire, especially with deliberations on a ceasefire ongoing. Many Western experts also believe that should Ukraine fall, it will be Poland who is next on the chopping block, and with no one truly understanding how the United States will react, Poland might need to develop a deterrence of their own. With this decision made by both Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and its president, Andrzej Duda, it seems like having nuclear weapons in Poland is a reality the world will eventually need to deal with. Poland has two main options for getting these nukes. First of all, Poland might choose to develop its own set of nuclear weapons. However, this takes years of planning and could take decades more to enact. The problem is that Poland might not have decades to finally develop its own deterrence program. This leaves option 2, which involves possibly convincing other Western allies to station some of its nuclear weapons in the country. This move is much easier and will also ensure almost immediate protection from Russia. Unfortunately, finding countries willing to do this might not be possible, especially since many in the West are trying to avoid the possibility of a nuclear war taking place. But one of the first to actually introduce this idea was none other than French President Emmanuel Macron. Make sure to smash that subscribe button to ensure you get your daily military report. On March 6, 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron went on record to talk about the possibility of Europe using the French nuclear deterrence as a way of discouraging Russia's aggression. The move was largely praised in the Baltic nations, but also welcomed by Duda himself. Russia was not as keen, labeling the move extremely confrontational, which could indicate its willingness to go to war to prevent this from happening. According to recent estimates, France has about 290 nuclear weapons. This is the second largest stockpile in NATO, only trailing the United States. France used to have 3 methods of delivering nuclear warheads. Unfortunately, the French disposed of the first, which used to be land-based. The IRBM base Ariane 200 Apt Saint-Christol was the largest in its arsenal, with shorter missiles like the Pluton and Hades being disbanded. Nowadays, France relies heavily on its air-based nuclear weapons. First is the 54 ASMPA medium-range air-to-ground missiles with the TNA, airborne nuclear warhead, which is often deployed on the new Dassault Rafale B. This new 4.5 generation fighter had replaced the previous Dassault Mirage 2000N. The aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle is largely responsible for carrying the Dassault Rafale M, which is a naval version operated on the aircraft carrier. These aircraft can comfortably carry its ordnance, which should be enough to deliver an absolutely devastating strike on its opponents. The second method of delivering this ordnance is via the 6 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. However, France only operates 4 Triomphant-class submarines at the time of this video. The French Navy deployed one of these to always lurk beneath the waves. 2 more are always on standby, with the 4th actively remaining in service. However, This changed in 2022, when the French Navy deployed a second at the same time Russia launched its needless invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps this was a coincidence? Nevertheless, each of these submarines is armed with 16 M51 SLBMs. This means that a single French nuclear submarine has enough firepower to destroy Europe if it needs to. By counting all these numbers, we find that at any time, France has around 118 nuclear warheads ready to be deployed, which leaves more than 50% of its remaining nuclear weapons just on standby. France could theoretically use these as a way of creating a nuclear umbrella that would possibly include Poland. For now, Poland operates the F-16, with about 36 of the F-16C variants being used as a multi-role fighter. This is backed up by 6 F-35 Lightning II aircraft, which should have the capability of actually carrying these nuclear warheads. They will need to be reconfigured, or the Polish will need to consider buying the Dassault Rafale B. Moreover, Poland doesn't have any nuclear submarines known to the world, and this puts them at quite a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to possibly launching these warheads. However, using US military equipment and having its military set up in a way that is already friendly to the US, it might make more sense to perhaps convince President Trump to station nuclear weapons in the country. Exactly how many nuclear weapons the United States has is often debated. Recent reports suggest that the number is likely to be around 3,700 nuclear warheads, which should make sense that the United States has a few more to spare. In fact, the US nuclear umbrella already extends to Europe and many NATO countries. While we are not exactly sure which countries have these nuclear weapons, it is suspected that Italy, Belgium, Germany, Turkey, and possibly even the Netherlands currently have access to US nuclear weapons. With so many unique diversions, including nuclear bombs, ICBMs, and SLBMs available to the United States, it is not worth having an in-depth look at each of them. However, the bomb variation of these warheads is stationed mostly in Europe and would need a good aircraft to transport them if they need to be deployed. This is generally done using actual bombers, who can carry such large orders. But there are also quite a few logistical issues as to why it would not make sense for the United States to send some of its bombs to Poland. To deliver a nuclear bomb, a bomber, or large aircraft is needed. Since these bombs are extremely heavy, it means the aircraft burns through quite a lot of fuel en route to its destination. This often requires the use of tanker aircraft, like what Israel had used in their 2024 direct strikes on Iran. Poland doesn't have these large tankers and would need to borrow or even develop some of their own. This means that despite the nuclear weapons being sent to Warsaw, they will still need NATO assistance when it comes to deploying them. A problem Poland will not have when using the smaller and more strategic French warheads. This creates a massive risk and logistical issue if Poland eventually needs to deploy them. With the assistance of Western counterparts, who might now also be dragged into this situation. So, having US nuclear weapons in Poland might simply not make sense. And this has led to a lot of debate in the country itself. Prime Minister Donald Tusk is pushing for the United States to add Poland to its nuclear umbrella, whereas President Andrzej Duda prefers the French military intervention. Now this is once again just politics talking. Both Tusk and Duda represent rival government parties. Tusk slides more to the left with the Civic platform, whereas Duda is part of the right-leaning PIS. Nevertheless, both of them are advocating for the same thing, and this is that Poland needs to have nuclear protection if they are to potentially avert a Russian invasion. But will it work? Ukraine used to be a part of the Soviet Union from 1922 till its fall in 1991. During this time, Russia had stationed various nuclear weapons in the country. However, Ukraine was forced to give up its arsenal to Russia following deliberation and a deal in the mid-1990s. Under the deal, Ukraine was given securities from both the United States and Russia, but this only lasted about 20 years, before Russia unceremoniously invaded Crimea, which used to be part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Following the Minsk agreements, Russia once again offered securities to Ukraine, and a ceasefire was called. However, President Volodymyr Zelensky claims that President Putin has violated this agreement no less than 25 times in the 8 years leading up to the full-scale invasion in 2022. Perhaps, if Ukraine had a few nuclear weapons at its disposal, Russia might have thought twice before making this move, which would have served as nuclear deterrence. Moreover, recent history has proven to us that nuclear deterrence is a real thing and not just a word thrown around. We only need to look at North Korea. It was first revealed in 2002 that North Korea had some form of nuclear weapons. They only did their first modern test in 2006, but at that time, the United States already expected that North Korea might have nuclear weapons. Since this admission, the world has ridiculed Pyongyang. However, the North Koreans, under the leadership of their supreme leader Kim Jong-un, have continued violating various international agreements. The West is yet to respond to any of these in earnest. The main reason for this lack of action is the fear of North Korea actually setting off one of these weapons. It currently has the capacity to not only strike its southern neighbors in Seoul, but could reach as far as Tokyo in Japan. This has naturally created quite a large threat to the world, in which North Korea is now the one calling the shots. But what it proves is the power of nuclear deterrence. Even the biggest nations in the world fear what Kim Jong-un is willing to do when pushed into a corner, and this is why nothing more than a few strong words are often used when North Korea pursues its nuclear endeavors. It also makes a very strong argument that had Ukraine been under the nuclear umbrella of its Western allies, the war would have been averted. At least, that is what Donald Tusk believes to be the truth about the situation. But there is even more motivation for Poland to request these weapons. Poland currently borders 7 other countries, but it is only 3 that currently pose a threat. To the east, the country borders both Belarus and Russia, while being directly on the western border of Ukraine. The Polish nation has even more reason to make these requests to its NATO allies, especially following the November 2022 explosion within its own borders. It was revealed that the explosion emanated from some kind of military weapon, but Russia claims that it was merely shrapnel from a Russian weapon that had already been shot down. Nevertheless, it does prove that Poland might need nuclear weapons. Let's say, for instance, the next one lands in Poland again. The country will not have anything noteworthy to retaliate with, and this will again show the country as being weak in the eyes of Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, the question remains of whether or not anyone is willing to send Ukraine nukes. As speculative as this might be, there is an actual possibility that Poland could receive nuclear weapons. However, this will be more than likely a European endeavor, with the United States currently not willing to continue assisting various countries. One thing is for sure, and that is the fact that the United States currently has a large contingent of troops that is stationed in Poland. Many other NATO countries also have a couple of troops in the vicinity, and this does present a natural deterrence. With French President Macron publicly talking about a nuclear umbrella for Europe, it is very possible that Poland might receive some of the aerial nuclear weapons. But this again presents the challenge of mounting them. As mentioned earlier, Poland does not have the Dassault Rafale or any variation thereof in their fleet of military aircraft. But what is often forgotten about is NATO Article 5, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all. This means that should Poland ever get invaded by Russia, the NATO countries will naturally be forced to respond. This does include the United States, but relying on the Trump administration has also become quite hard for Europe. One guarantee is the fact that Europe will almost certainly stand up for Poland, which again ensures that the country has some form of nuclear backing. However, the current progress made in discussions between Kyiv, Moscow, and Washington means that this war might be ending abruptly. If it does end, and Ukraine receives various security guarantees, it will provide a natural buffer for Poland to the east. So, how will Russia react? First of all, Russia immediately reacted by calling the move extremely confrontational. Should more nuclear weapons be spread across Europe, it puts Russia at a massive disadvantage. This would almost certainly lead to an escalation in the current Ukraine situation. In fact, Russia would use this as a way of not agreeing to a deal. Moreover, Russia might also see this as an aggressive move, since many of these countries were once part of the Soviet Union, all forming the Iron Curtain that naturally protected the Soviets from Western aggression. Another crucial element to this discussion is President Donald Trump. Trump is currently cozying up to President Putin, or at least, he is trying to make deals that could bring Russia back into the G8, now G7. If Trump does not want to antagonize Russia further, he might refuse to assist in protecting Poland. He could use the US influence in countries like NATO to perhaps even dissuade France from sending nuclear weapons to member states. However, it remains to be seen whether Donald Trump is merely seeking a peace prize in minerals, and he is only using diplomacy as a way of getting Putin to agree to these deals. But judging from Democrat rhetoric out of Washington, they believe that President Trump is trying to align himself with Russia, something the US leader has denied, saying he is acting in the best interest of the world. So, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that Europe is rearming itself and completely fears potential Russian aggression in the future. However, not all stakeholders are on board, and many of these countries, who don't agree, have a lot of influence in NATO itself. If you believe Poland should get nuclear weapons, let us know in the comments below. Make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for your military report. If this deterrent doesn't work as it should, Zelensky will have nowhere to hide, especially with US pressure mounting. But how is it mounting?
В трубе, труба куда ведет? На суджу. Это же ё... Никогда бы не подумал.
Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev said that Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk are almost completely encircled by Russian forces.
With the war hanging by a thread, both Russia and Ukraine are unleashing everything to ensure they have leverage at any upcoming peace talks. However, what Russia just did completely caught Zelensky off guard. A secret Kursk offensive, launched by Russia, would aim to completely retake the region, driving Ukraine out of Russian territory and giving Moscow all the cards heading into crucial negotiations. And it seems like it is all about to shift in the favor of the Russian Federation. Located on the southwestern border of Russia is a large swath of land called the Kursk Oblast. The area was once a pivotal territory that would allow Russia to easily deploy troops to the front line. Following the 2024 partial halt in US aid to Ukraine, Russia began making more and more gains, especially along the southern parts of Ukraine. Once Congress approved the delivery of aid, Ukraine had to make a move, something that would prove to its Western allies that the country could still fight. On August 8, 2024, about 1,000 troops of the Ukrainian armed forces would cross the border into Kursk. They were met with many skirmishes involving the Russian border guard, but slowly managed to gain a foothold. Accompanying these troops were battalions of tanks, all being reinforced with armored vehicles. Russia quickly scrambled to repel the attack, but by the end of the first week, Ukraine had taken about 390 square miles of land, including the capture of 28 settlements within the territory. Moreover, Russia continued throwing more and more troops at the region, including a donation of 10,000 North Korean troops to shore up these front lines. It worked, with the whole operation stalling just 2 months later in October. Russia naturally withdrew troops from other conflict zones on the front line, deploying large battalions to stem the advances of Ukraine. It naturally worked as Russia retook about half the territory it had lost in just under 2 weeks. The battle lines were stable, leading to numerous smaller skirmishes among the captured settlements. According to Ukrainian authorities, The main goal of the offensive was to help other parts of the battlefield, and this makes a lot of sense when you look at it. With Russian home territory now under attack, Moscow had to redeploy many of its troops back to Kursk. This reduced some pressure on the front lines. Moreover, various critical supply routes ran through Kursk. With these lines now disrupted, Russian reinforcements and resupply would take a massive hit. However, the biggest benefit of this offensive was to target Russian artillery. Moscow has been launching various artillery strikes from within its own borders. The offensive would drive back all these artillery regiments, further reducing some of the pressure placed on the front lines within Ukraine. Finally, the biggest reason for the Kursk offensive was to give Ukraine some leverage when it comes to negotiations. Holding a bit of Russian territory would possibly allow the Ukrainians to negotiate for more of its own land as well. This hasn't happened yet, and then the front lines in Kursk stalled. For almost 6 months now, neither party has made any real gains, and much like the rest of the war, it has turned into a war of attrition. Now, almost a year into the conflict, estimates suggest that Ukraine has sustained around 49,000 casualties, with almost 3,000 pieces of equipment lost. On the Russian side, it is estimated that they have suffered 48,000 casualties, with 20,000 deceased, and another 6,000 North Koreans deceased or wounded. Russia has lost about 2,432 pieces of equipment, including 931 tactical and strategic UAVs. So, this has been a very costly offensive on both sides of the battlefield. Starting the new year, Russia continued trying to recapture more and more territory, but this would come at a massive price. Nevertheless, Russia claimed to have taken back most of the smaller localities like Orlovka, Pogrebi, and Novaya Sorochina. But the advances remained slow until early March. On March 6th, news broke of a secret Russian attack. It was reported that these forces had advanced near the village of Kurlakoa, to the south of Sudzha. While this didn't seem like a big deal, Ukraine soon realized that it posed a massive threat to its defensive lines. Moreover, Russia spent the next few days driving deeper and deeper into the Ukrainian defensive line, breaking through and posing a serious threat to resupply lines. On March 7th, Reuters reported that Ukraine was being encircled within the Kursk Oblast. Drone and artillery attacks directly target supply lines, also cutting off many of the troops falling back. But what is really shocking is the fact that no one truly saw this coming. Just a week ago, at the time of creating this video, Ukraine still had a massive foothold in Kursk, but what they missed was the abandoned Urengoy-Pomory-Uzhgorod pipeline. The pipeline runs north to south, starting from the Urengoy gas fields and then passing through Izhevsk, Yelets, Kursk, Romny, Chmerinka, Bohorocheny, Ivano-Frankivsk, and finally stopping near the Ukrainian borders with both Slovakia and Hungary in Uzhhorod. The pipeline, which was established in 1984, served a massive natural gas transportation system up to the end of 2024. This stopped when Ukraine did not renew the contract to receive more Russian gas. However, the dormant pipeline would lead to a move nobody truly expected from Russia. Various Russian bloggers suggest that Russian forces entered the pipeline under the cover of darkness. They would traverse it for about 16 kilometers, spending several days inside. The troops would again re-emerge from the pipeline, but this time they were behind enemy lines. The move completely cut off various support lines and led to an encirclement of Ukrainian troops. Many believe that Russia had caught Ukraine off guard with this move, but Ukrainian military sources deny this, suggesting that they had been aware of this for some time. Unfortunately, troops and resources had to be shifted to Kurilovka, where Russian forces were beginning to break through Ukrainian lines. Given that the troops stationed near the pipeline were understaffed and under-resourced, they simply didn't have the means of blowing up the pipeline. This would be a grave error, which could potentially lead to the end of the Kursk offensive. Over the next few days, Russia continued making more and more advances. Sources revealed that villages such as Cherkasskoye, Porechnoye, Kubatkin, north of Sudzha, and Viktorovka were among those that were ultimately retaken. However, taking these villages is not the primary goal of these Russian forces. A day later, on March 9th, Russian bloggers reported that the large town of Sudzha was under attack from various directions. This was confirmed by many international sources. But whilst the battle for Sudzha is still underway, Russia has taken another 12 settlements in the area. These include Agranom, Bogdanovka, Bondarevka, Dmitriukov, Zazulevka, Ivashkovsky, Kolmakov, Kubatkin, Martinovka, Mikhailovka, Pravda, and Yuzhny. The scary thing is that this entire offensive stemmed from the critical Ukrainian error of ignoring the natural gas pipeline. It also puts the town of Sudzha in a bad position, where there is a real risk of full encirclement that will force Ukraine to withdraw many of its troops. By all accounts, Ukraine's only bit of territorial leverage seems to be slipping away. And with more and more Western pressure mounting on President Vladimir Zelensky, it doesn't look great for the Ukrainian forces as of this video. The initial incursion also led to various other forms of aggression from Russia. Many can probably remember that just a few days after Ukraine took over most of the territory, Russia responded by changing its nuclear doctrine. Under this new doctrine, Russia could perhaps go the route of nuclear warfare if it feels that its sovereign territory is being attacked. This is exactly what happened. But President Putin didn't resort to using nuclear weapons. Instead, he bided his time, waiting for the current situation to unfold. After the souring of diplomatic ties between Kyiv and Washington, Putin noticed that it would be the perfect time to strike. Not only does this remove further leverage on the battlefield for Ukraine, but more and more pressure is mounting on the Ukrainian head of state. So, what does this truly mean for Ukraine? First of all, Russia will need to retake the town of Sudzha. This town is far more strategic than you might think. It offers numerous routes from Ukraine, allowing these troops to resupply. Should Russia drive out the Ukrainian troops, it could lead to another line opening up. Russia can continue pouring troops into the eastern part of Ukraine, which adds more and more pressure on the current front lines. Ukraine seems to be already under pressure further down to the south, especially along Kupiansk. Recently, Russian forces have been making massive gains in the area. The city of Pokrovsk is also looking more and more likely to fall, with Russian forces advancing on either side, possibly looking to encircle the area. This would be a major loss of territory for Ukraine, and it could even lead to troops moving down south to the city of Zaporizhzhia. This will put a lot of strain on Ukrainian troops and wipe out a lot of the currently liberated territory. Should Kursk fall, it will enable the influx of these Russian troops and also open up more supply lines. Moreover, it enables Russia to redeploy many of its artillery back to the Ukrainian border. These will then be used to pummel Ukrainian defenses. Now that U.S. aid to Ukraine has been frozen pending a review, it will further damage the landscape of the war. As Zelensky begins to lose more and more territory, the West might not continue being so enthusiastic in sending billions of dollars of aid. Furthermore, it will affect the negotiations as well. Despite several attempts at peace talks failing, President Donald Trump seems adamant on pursuing peace. Whether it is something he truly believes will work, or if he is trying to get that elusive Nobel Peace Prize, Trump is sure of peace negotiations in 2025. However, there is one problem. Ukraine has not yet been invited to the negotiation table. What we know of the current peace talks, which were recently released, is that the Trump administration aims to have it implemented by April 20th. Trump calls this the 100-day peace plan for Ukraine. The original proposal, which would bring an immediate stoppage to the war, would require Ukraine to withdraw all its troops from the Kursk region. However, Russia would not be required to return any territory it has seized back to Ukraine. According to U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, returning to pre-war 2014 Ukrainian borders is simply unrealistic and only prolongs the war. Hegseth continued to say that the U.S. believes that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. But this again has not yet been confirmed by the Kremlin. In fact, nobody knows exactly which concessions Russia will need to make for this peace agreement to come into effect. Being adopted as part of NATO would make the most sense, but it will also never be accepted by the Russian leaders. If Ukraine were to join NATO, it meant that Russia's biggest adversary would be directly on its front doorstep, even leading to the possibility of NATO nuclear weapons being stationed so close to Russia. For Ukraine, this simply doesn't give them any real security. As President Zelensky suggested, Russia has broken ceasefire agreements 25 times since the Minsk Agreement was enacted, following the 2014 Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. This means that Ukraine doesn't trust Russia to abide by any new rules, regardless of who the U.S. president is. Ukraine had heavily relied on its presence in Kursk as a way of giving it a little bit of leverage when it comes to negotiations. Essentially, for this to be enacted, Ukrainian President Zelensky will need to put his signature on paper. This doesn't seem likely unless Ukraine will have enough security guarantees, a demand that led to the Ukrainian president being unceremoniously kicked out of the White House. Moreover, Trump believes that sending U.S. companies and civilians to process rare earth minerals would provide enough of a backstop. Basically, Washington says that Russia will never dare break a ceasefire if it means that there could be U.S. casualties. But Zelensky is not so sure, and neither is the rest of Europe. Should Trump be willing to station U.S. boots on the ground to enforce and maintain peace, he believes that this could remove any motivation for Russia to once again launch an offensive. But do you think that having U.S. civilians would be enough to stop the Russians from launching another invasion? According to various media sources, many believe that both President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin have some kind of friendship. The rumors began following Trump's 90-minute call with his Russian counterpart, whereby both claimed that negotiations took place. This completely sidelined Volodymyr Zelensky in the process. Moreover, Trump continued calling Putin a strong and smart leader during many of his press meetings throughout February. He also stood up for Putin in the White House, despite what Zelensky had said, further solidifying his support for the Russian dictator. Putin also responded, calling Trump a pragmatic and trusting leader when he described his relationship with the U.S. president. But most important is the fact that these two have been seeing eye to eye for the better part of the last decade. Trump was a staunch defender of Putin when Democrats claimed Russian interference in the 2016 election, while also suggesting that Putin is supportive of the claims Biden didn't win the 2020 election. All of this confirms what the world has probably been thinking. Putin and Trump might be closer than we think, and could perhaps even share a friendship. Such a close relationship will seriously affect the Ukrainian peace talks, suggesting that the biggest Ukrainian backer is now negotiating with the intentions of helping its biggest adversary. In reality, a lot of this is still speculation, but the fact remains that Russia has finally managed to break the Ukrainian stranglehold on the Kursk region. This could significantly reduce its leverage in negotiations, but it remains a mystery as to how this would play out. Should all of this actually happen, and there could be some ceasefire talks, it might be possible for the war to come to an end. However, what will such a peace agreement look like?
Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said that a number of countries were ready to join Europe's new coalition of the willing to help Ukraine.
Coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine.
Are we on the brink of World War III? Donald Trump seems to think so. Well, 3 years after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is finally seeking a solution. But not just any solution, one that will perhaps grant Ukraine full independence while ensuring the safety and security of its people. But with no such agreement reached in Washington over the weekend, Ukraine has turned to its allies in Europe. And now, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer seems to have the answers. A new way of ensuring Ukrainian security, but at what risk? Perhaps the risk of the infamous British Eurofighter Typhoon FGR-4. But will it work? And what does the US have to say about this possible provocative move on the backdrop of the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? A light can finally be seen at the end of the tunnel. But this might not be the kind of peace Ukraine is seeking. February 12, 2025, marked an historic day, and the first time since the war that a US president would directly communicate with President Putin. This time, it was US President Donald Trump, and according to his team, the call lasted about 1.5 hours. But this 90-minute call would have far bigger ramifications for the war than any other call had before. President Trump explained the call by mentioning the wide variety of topics the two had discussed. According to his Truth Social statement, the call covered everything, including AI, the Middle East situation, energy, the US dollar, and most importantly, the situation in Ukraine. But this was the moment the US's demeanor toward Ukraine changed. Trump would lash out at Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on various occasions following the call, which includes calling the Ukrainian president a dictator on numerous occasions. It was clear Trump had shifted his priorities. Instead of protecting Ukraine, Trump wanted to find a way for the US to get out of funding the war or striking a deal. Moreover, the day after the call, the markets had already reacted. The Moscow Exchange, or MOX, rose by over 6%, while the RTS index further rose by another 6%. Both clearly indicated that the call between Putin and Trump was positive for both parties. But this is not all. So, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell and make sure you stay informed. According to the Trump administration, plans are already in the works for the two presidents to meet. Saudi Arabia would make the most sense, with its crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, having great relations with both parties. In fact, the phone call set off a major chain of events. Less than a week later, a meeting was called in Saudi Arabia. On the US side was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and in a somewhat unknown capacity, Steve Witkoff. Representing Russia was Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov. The main topic of conversation? A ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. But what shocked the world was the fact that neither Ukraine nor any representative of the EU was invited. In fact, Russia and the US possibly discussed the future of Ukraine, with no stakeholders present. So, the EU kicked into action, trying to find their own way to bring a ceasefire to the war. An emergency summit was called in Paris, seeking a new way to punish Russia. But what was the answer? Well, sanctions. In a very predictable move, the EU imposed their 16th round of sanctions on the Russian Federation. This move would target virtually every possible stream of revenue the Russian government had from Europe. But a quick look at the history of sanctions to Russia doesn't prove to be effective. Despite it being highly effective during the first years of the war, now it has diminishing effects. Following the first few rounds of sanctions, inflation skyrocketed from 6.8% to a whopping 13.8%, and GDP fell between 3 and 4%. Despite what the media tells you about these sanctions not being effective, many did wonders, but the large majority didn't have such a drastic effect on the Russian economy. Russia would quickly establish partnerships with the likes of China, Iran, and India in a bid to continue trading. Nevertheless, the Russian economy is still struggling, with inflation at 9.9% and interest rates over 20% to combat this inflationary problem. On top of these sanctions, various European countries also vowed continuous military support to Russia, including the big question of how Ukraine will remain secure when a ceasefire is finally agreed to. One such suggestion is the deployment of the British Eurofighter Typhoon, a 4.5 generation, multi-role fighter that will be tasked with policing the air around the Ukrainian border. On top of that, Prime Minister Starmer have suggested British boots on the ground. The idea is that these boots on the ground would serve as a deterrence to Russian soldiers. Many expect that much like the Minsk Agreement. Following the 2014 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia might again try to violate a ceasefire. Having European troops on the ground, along with the coveted Eurofighters, would significantly deter the Russians. Well, that is the thought of Keir Starmer. He also exclaimed the need for a U.S. backstop, or at least some kind of security guarantee that would further deter Russia. According to Starmer, the UK and other European members would increase military production, including a recent announcement of building more than 5,000 air defense missiles to be delivered to Ukraine over the next few years. Interestingly, the UK has also cut its aid budget from 0.5% to 0.3% of its GDP. This will now be moved to increasing its defense budget. Starmer believes it should be around 2% of total GDP by 2027. But there is a problem. Can the UK actually afford to have boots on the ground in Ukraine? By all estimates, the UK would be able to have around 4,000, if not fewer, troops to permanently place in Ukraine. According to the House of Commons, the UK currently has around 148,000 military personnel, of which just over 75,320, are considered to be active. Of this, just over 10,000 are actively stationed across Europe, a far cry from the more than 60,000 U.S. troops in Europe and the additional 10,000 rotational troops the U.S. have stationed in Poland alone. By all estimates, the UK would be able to have around 4,000, if not fewer, troops to permanently place in Ukraine. These troops will need to cover more than 1,400 miles along the Ukrainian border. However, France has about 200,000 active personnel, including another 180,000 for Germany. This means that, to cover the entirety of Ukraine's eastern border, the UK will need the assistance of these two giants. Unfortunately, Emmanuel Macron later denied any French troops to Ukraine, merely suggesting in early January that French troops might assist in training Ukrainian soldiers. This doesn't provide enough security for the Ukrainians to prevent another full-scale Russian invasion. Well, in steps the Eurofighter Typhoon once again. This unique aircraft is slightly more powerful and advanced than the fourth-generation F-16, but it doesn't truly compare with the likes of F-22 Raptor or the F-35. What the Eurofighter does do, however, is pose a direct threat to Russia. Its unique design, including advanced avionics and stealth capabilities, makes it one of the ideal policing aircraft, possibly even giving Ukraine the ability to overcome Russian air defenses. Fortunately, Starmer didn't say the UK would give Ukraine these aircraft, but rather operate them on Ukrainian soil. The question is whether this is a good decision, or does it put British pilots at risk? Well, the UK currently houses around 137 of these aircraft. They are evenly split between the Tranche 1, Tranche 2, and Tranche 3 variants. The RAF, who heavily relies on this armament, would now have to determine how many they are willing to sacrifice to Ukraine, to put it bluntly. Now, this might seem like an easy choice, given the fact that the UK is not at war, but the current geopolitical climate does leave one vulnerable. Moreover, the UK only has about 37 F-35B aircraft, only serving as a Level 1 partner on the US F-35 program. Ideally, this plan would work to keep Russian drones and aviation aggression at bay, but there is still one thing that needs to be answered. If the UK supplies these aircraft to Ukraine following the ceasefire deal, what happens if Russia shoots down a British aircraft? Does Britain retaliate? Will it enforce Article 4 of the NATO agreement? And is the UK willing to risk further escalation with Russia? Despite the EU banding together, making decisions, and further rallying behind Ukraine, nothing can be done without a US backstop. Even Prime Minister Starmer acknowledged this in a recent meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. One thing the world already knows is that Russia doesn't fear the EU, nor does it fear the UK. However, Russia doesn't want to be embroiled in a conflict with the United States. Since the two countries both have a host of nuclear weapons, Russia would never risk a direct confrontation with the United States. So, what does a backstop mean? Well, Zelensky is adamant about having US boots on the ground, but not just any boots. Ukraine wants the United States to set up a military presence along the Russian border. But if you remember back to the start of the war, this will never work. In fact, Ukraine desperately wanted to become part of NATO. The idea was that this would not only protect them under Article 4 of the NATO agreement, but it would permit the US to set up shop on the Russian border. The idea, which was floated by the Biden administration, was quickly shot down in negotiations. So, Putin would never accept US boots on his western border. It is too much of a risk, and despite Donald Trump being in office, Putin is thinking far off in the future. This brings us back to policing the air around the Ukrainian border as the best solution to assist European boots on the ground. The idea won't work, and the numbers speak for themselves. As mentioned, the RAF has 137 of these aircraft, at a readiness of 60%. This means that about 80 of these planes can fly at any time. According to many reports, it would take not one, not two, not 10, but dozens of these aircraft to patrol the skies around the Ukrainian border. But the RAF can only deploy about 30 if adequate spares are available. Moreover, the Russian S-400 missile system is touted to be one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. On the other hand, the Russian Air Force has over 900 aircraft, split between MiGs and the newer Su variations. In fact, the Russian MiG-31 has a reputation of outperforming many fourth-generation fighters. And despite the fact that the Eurofighter is far superior, it is simply outnumbered. Furthermore, this would mean that the RAF could deploy 2 aircraft every couple of hours, which would leave numerous gaps in its defense. To make this work, the RAF would need to deploy its full squadrons of operational aircraft if it were to provide 24-hour protection. Fortunately, there is a possible solution to this problem, namely the Mirage 2000 as a way of plugging up the gaps. Yes, France has recently pledged the delivery of about 24 Mirage 2005 aircraft to assist in Ukraine, and many experts suggest that these are already designed to make them effective as part of Western air defense systems. On top of this, these Mirage 2000 aircraft are also operated by Ukrainian pilots. This means that various policing strategies could be coordinated. The Ukrainian Air Force can effectively combine with the RAF and other willing members to set up a decent air defense system. The Mirage is also considered a fourth-generation fighter and has vastly outperformed the F-16 in the Ukrainian war. Despite the F-16 being a better combat aircraft, the Mirage has the ability to carry the highly effective Storm Shadow missiles. This long-range cruise missile has been used to devastating effect in the Black Sea. Its long-range strike capabilities also allow Ukraine to strike deep into the Russian territory. This by itself already creates a lot of unease among the Russian president. By all accounts, such a setup could lead to a time bomb, just waiting to be triggered. Which brings us back to a US backstop, or more NATO intervention. Not every NATO partner can, or even wants to support Russia. With Poland being the last defensive stronghold, should Russia take Ukraine, it puts a lot of pressure on the country. Poland has mentioned the fact that various missions are being conducted to secure its own border. The Operations Command of the Polish Armed Forces also assured that it is closely monitoring the war, while being on its highest level of readiness. This is the highest level of readiness Warsaw had ever seen. The other wild card to this situation is Turkey. Recently, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has stated that Turkey is willing to host peace negotiations between the two parties. A ceasefire here would be very beneficial for Turkey. In fact, its government has been treading a very fine line between the two parties. Ankara has been vocal about the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine, while maintaining strong economic ties with the Russian Federation. It has also exclaimed that, while Turkey will contribute to peace talks, they will not be part of enforcing it. This basically eliminates Europe's second biggest military from peace proceedings. It also firmly puts the ball back into the hands of the other EU nations. Essentially, it significantly reduces NATO's ability to enforce a ceasefire without the assistance of the United States. So, what is Donald Trump's plan to have and maintain peace in Ukraine? It doesn't take a genius to figure out that Trump and Zelensky currently don't see eye to eye. In fact, the world is seeing far more agreement from Putin to Trump's ideas than it does from Zelensky, and it is currently causing all sorts of chaos in Europe. On Friday, February 28th, Presidents Trump and Zelensky met for the first time following his inauguration. The plan for the meeting was to ensure a deal could be struck between the United States and Ukraine. While many of the details are still unknown, White House officials have confirmed that the deal entails Ukrainian minerals. The U.S. would be entitled to help mine and process these minerals in a bid to make up for U.S. support. But it doesn't say anything about security guarantees to Ukraine. Unfortunately, the meeting ended as soon as it began. In an unprecedented moment, U.S. President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance would engage in a war of words with the Ukrainian leader. Zelensky found himself booted from the White House in the aftermath. Unfortunately, no deal was reached. According to Trump, the deal itself would provide a backstop. Since the United States will be investing in the country, it means ordinary U.S. civilians would be on the ground. These citizens will be responsible for processing these rare earth minerals, while also rebuilding the country. Trump believes that if U.S. citizens are present in Ukraine, Putin wouldn't dare to make a move. Republicans across the board, including Senator Lindsey Graham, seem to agree. But this move would be far more beneficial to the U.S. than it would Ukraine. It will stop the aid to Ukraine, saving the U.S. taxpayer money, but also disrupt the current military-industrial complex. Moreover, the U.S. would have rights to Ukrainian minerals that could put them on par with China. This move will see the U.S. ensure future dominance as the global superpower. It also keeps U.S. boots out of Ukraine, saving on military costs, and perhaps even a possible outbreak of conflict. Trump also floated the idea that Ukraine would have to cede some of its territory. In fact, Trump mentioned this throughout his 2024 presidential campaign. Number 47 believes that Biden should have stopped the war sooner, but now it is too late for Ukraine to hold on to all its territory. What we can say is that Donbass and Crimea are certainly off the table for the Ukrainians, but cities like Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, and Kherson are among those cities still disputed. Furthermore, no one truly knows the extent of resources in Ukraine. In fact, the last audit done was by the Soviets. Experts also suggest that most of the resources the U.S. wants are in these occupied territories, and it doesn't seem like Putin is ready to cede the territory he has taken. By all accounts, this seems like a stalemate as of the time of this video, but things can change in an instant. Unless consensus can be reached soon, it doesn't seem like the war will end anytime soon. The North Korean injection of troops has given Russia another lifeline. Russia also doesn't care about using the war as a meat grinder. In layman's terms, Russia is prepared for a war of attrition and ready to wait it out. Putin understands that unless Ukraine makes meaningful moves, Western allies will eventually grow tired of this war. This is already happening in countries like Germany and France, where right-wing parties are slowly increasing in the polls. The major divide between Europe and the U.S. in this situation is not helpful either, and perhaps this could lead to the U.S. splitting from NATO. Faced with such a threat, NATO might need to consider focusing on itself instead of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will the UK strategy of policing the air work? Does Europe have enough Eurofighter Typhoons? And will the U.S. eventually allow for the F-35 to assist? These are the major questions after this incredible week in geopolitics. Make sure to like and subscribe and smash that notification bell as we release videos every single day.